Today we're talking about schools of literary criticism, and it's going to serve as an introduction to critical theory for literature. A lot of times students expect instructors to tell them what text means, but in many cases instructors will present multiple schools of thought and allow students to choose the school of thought that best suits them. So that's something that I really want to encourage for you all to do, and to understand where these different schools of thought come from and how they are used. So a little background. Many of us read for pleasure. It's rather simple. We read the words, we understand what they mean, we follow the story through the plot and character development. And even though it's a simple process, we are making connections to what we read. It becomes a conversation between us and the author, the writer. When we read a little deeper, we begin to look for other things. We look at the context, the time and place something was written, who the author is, and where they are coming from. We look at symbolism, whether it's repeated images and words or metaphors, symbols, physical symbols that are used to represent something. We look at the tone of language that an author uses, and we look at the words that they choose. When we want to delve even deeper, we look at the various schools of critical theory. So we'll look at some schools here as we will then apply them to things that we read. I don't want to focus on any one specific lens, as it's called, because I want you to find the school of critical theory that best suits you. Most experts in literature follow a particular school of thought or lens of theory that they apply to what they read. And the idea is that if you can use a theory and support it with evidence from the text, it works. It's as simple as that. There are some theories that can't be applied to certain texts simply because there is no connection, no matter how hard you may try to bend the text to fit it. But ultimately, using these lenses, these schools of critical theory, reading becomes like a jigsaw puzzle where all of the pieces fit together once to create the story, the play, the poem that we read. But then you can change how the pieces are put together. You just have to make sure that those pieces fit without bending them or cutting them or changing them in any way. And when you put those pieces together in different ways, the picture may change, but there's still a picture. It's not just a jumble of color. There's something there. So, some history on critical theory. It didn't really become a thing until the 1940s. Literature has always been a very ripe field for interpretation. And critical theory in some form or another has really existed since people began telling stories, not even just reading. But critical theory itself didn't become a prominent component of interpretation until the 1940s. Prior to this, critics would apply a school of philosophical thought, think back to what you know about philosophy, and apply that to a piece of literature, or they would look at it simply from a historical perspective, or they would relate what they knew about the author's life to the piece. Then in 1947, Canadian theorist Northrop Frye published a book called Fearful Symmetry, and in the book he analyzed the poetry of William Blake. He followed that book up 10 years later with a book called Anatomy of Criticism. And these two books really set a groundwork for formal critical theory. American Harold Bloom thought that Fry was he was on the right path, and Bloom became known as a theorist in his own right and gained great popularity in the 1990s, even though he had been analyzing literature for decades prior using Fry's principles. An interesting thing to note, though, is that Fry, who set the groundwork for formal critical theory of literature, he was just following his passion. He didn't go to school for it. He didn't have any advanced degrees in English or literature. He just started writing Fearful Symmetry because he absolutely loved the poetry of William Blake and learned everything he could about Blake and the poetry and how everything fit, and wrote his interpretations. So this isn't something that is limited to the quote-unquote elites, and I think that that's important to note. So there are lots of schools of critical theory or lenses. These are just some of them. They are, I would say, the most popular over the course of time. There are some subgenres of schools or subcategories of schools of critical theory. But these are like the big guys. Now, I want to preface this by saying that you will not agree with all of them. That's the beauty of this. You will be able to learn about a whole bunch of different ones and pick the one that fits you best. And hopefully that is the school or lens that you can then apply to everything that you read. So keep that in mind. I don't expect each and every one of you to subscribe to each and every one of these lenses. It's up to you to choose. So first up, we've got Formalism and New Criticism. They're lumped together because they take a similar approach. They both look at literature, or the pieces of literature, as singular things. They don't look at history. They don't place anything in a historical context. They don't look at the author's life and how that may have influenced what they wrote. They don't look at culture. They look at the language. They look at the structure, the organization of the text. And this was an incredibly popular method of literary analysis before Fry. It has really fallen out of favor, but you can still find, when doing research, lots of articles that apply these lenses to pieces of literature. When I was in college, I had a professor who just was going to hang on to this until his dying breath. And he would give us readings for the class. We didn't buy a textbook. He handed out readings on photocopies. And every time he gave us something to read, we never got the information about who wrote it. And that's one of the key things with Formalism and New Criticism. Who wrote it is not as important as what was written. So then next up we have, let's look at an example here. And I'm going to use Romeo and Juliet as the primary example throughout because I think that that's a story that you are all familiar with. So under Formalism and New Criticism, Romeo and Juliet wouldn't be looked at in terms of the history of Verona, Italy. It wouldn't be considered that the story predates Shakespeare. They wouldn't look at the depictions of the families, the Capulets and Montagues. They wouldn't look at the depictions of class. Instead, they would look at Romeo and Juliet as a testament to how strong love is, how love can overcome all adversity which I always found kind of strange because it does make it seem like they forgot that both Romeo and Juliet die at the end of the play. They overlook the humor, the double entendres. They take every word at face value, and to me that also seems a bit of a shame because then all of Shakespeare's cheeky humor just gets lost and overlooked. The next lens is reader response. As the name implies, this is really exemplary of a conversation between the author and the reader. What the reader brings to the table is just as important as what the author wrote. So each reader comes to a text with their own experiences and their own frame of reference, and that then is applied to what they are reading. The cool thing about this is that no two people will ever interpret any piece of literature in exactly the same way. It is really reader specific. It's a one-of-a-kind interpretation. And one of the things that reader response really encourages is called recursive reading. And that simply means that you are encouraged to reread things that you have read before, because every time you read it, you are a different person. So your experiences have changed since the last time you read it. Your frame of reference has changed since the last time you read it. So your overall part of the conversation will then also change. And if we were to apply reader response to Romeo and Juliet, we remember that they are teenagers. She is 13. So if we come to Romeo and Juliet as a young reader, as a young teenager, we may read or see, because plays are meant to be seen, the play, and we may romanticize the relationship. We may view it as the quintessential love story. You watch it and you sigh because, oh, it's so romantic. An adult reading it or seeing it may look at it very differently. They may think of Romeo and Juliet as just two dumb teenagers that, make really poor decisions. Or they could focus on the adult characters, primarily the nurse and, to a lesser extent, the parents. If that adult happens to be a parent, they may actually focus on the relationship that Romeo has with his parents and the relationship that Juliet has with hers, and try to use that as a way to understand the plot of the play and the events that occur. The next lens is feminist criticism, and this emerged in the 60s, and it's rooted in a book called A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. It focuses on women not as a sex, but a gender. So remember that gender is the social construct and sex is biological. So here we're looking at gender, how women are presented and interpreted by both culture and society. And for a really long time, literature that was written by women was seriously overlooked. And if it did garner any attention, it was because the woman published under a male name, or it was like, oh, look how cute, she wrote something. Feminist criticism made a shift and pointed out the fact that patriarchal culture has historically presented women as quote-unquote other, something that is unknown or difficult to understand, has presented women as, especially women characters, as fitting particular stereotypes. And feminist theory looks at these female characters and feminist ideals in a different way. It's really analyzing how the women are being presented. It's not something that is limited to characters written by women. It can certainly be applied to women characters that were written by men. It is not something that says women characters are better than male characters. It's not something that says women writers are better than male writers. It's looking at women in terms of characters and writers and how they are presented and interpreted by society. So if we were to take this lens and apply it to Romeo and Juliet, it would look at the female characters. Now, as a whole, Shakespeare has 3 stereotypes for his female characters. You get the bawdy woman. A great example is the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. She's got some really funny lines if you understand the lingo. You get the tragic innocent, and you get the femme fatale. Now, for the purposes of Romeo and Juliet, the tragic innocent is Juliet. She's expected to do what her father tells her. She has no say in her life decisions. She shifts from listening to her father to listening and following all of the decisions that Romeo and others make for her. She's just a victim of circumstance, so to speak. If we want to look at the third stereotype that Shakespeare has for his female characters, the femme fatale, I would say that probably my favorite is Lady Macbeth, who within the matter of an afternoon convinces her husband that he has to be a murderer in order to prove that he's a man. And she does so by saying, I'm essentially, I would do it. So, I'd be more of a man than you if you don't do it. Definitely fits the stereotype for the femme fatale. Now, again, this is not saying that Juliet is better than Romeo. It's looking at how she is presented and how she is presented by the author and viewed by society as it exists in the play. There is no better or worse. Then we get Marxist theory, which this one is always kind of a fun one. This one and the next one. Marxist theory is based on the social and economic theories of Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels. You probably have heard of Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto. And you might wonder, how the heck does that work with literature? Well, the theory was that capitalism should or would be overthrown by the working class in favor of equality. So by taking that ideology, Marxist theory looks at literature and focuses on the struggles and exploitation of the working class. It looks at the split or the dichotomy of the cultural and economic elite and the working class, the divide that occurs, and it's not limited to a particular culture. We can apply this to a lot of different things. If this is, your preferred method, it can work very well. So with Romeo and Juliet, a Marxist lens might look at Romeo and see him as a symbol of the cultural and economic elite, and Juliet as the oppressed working class. He steps in, Romeo steps in and takes over, making decisions for her, in place of her father. So he is the elite. And Juliet, being the oppressed working class, has this momentary victory over the elite Romeo when she, is alive and he is not, so she thinks, and ends up succumbing in the end. So a Marxist theorist could argue that this is representative of the parasitic relationship between the economic elite and the working class. One simply cannot survive without the other. They need each other. Now, this may sound a little bit out there. That's possible. But you'll find lots of articles when doing research about this. The next one, too, might seem a little bit out there. It's the Psychoanalytic Theory, namely Freudian theory. It's based on Sigmund Freud's theories that significant portions of our lives don't necessarily take place in a conscious state. You know, he was big on dreams, that we suppress our true selves, and that suppression is necessary in order for us to live a harmonious life with others, that our repressed selves, namely our true selves, emerge in our dreams, and that, you know, sexuality is the root of our true selves and therefore must be repressed so that we can live harmoniously. His most known theories are the Oedipus Complex and its sister, the Electra Complex. If you are not familiar, the Oedipus Complex is, in a nutshell, that every little boy wants his father to die so he can live forever and marry his mother. And the Electra Complex is the converse, so that every little girl wants her mother to die or disappear so that she can live happily ever after and marry her father. Freud felt that these theories were universally applicable. They applied to everybody, no matter what. I will say that a lot of Freud's theories have been debunked in terms of psychoanalysis and psychology, but they still linger because he is such a well-known figure. Jacques Lacan took Freudian theory and he combined it with the next two lenses we'll look at, structuralism and deconstruction. And instead of looking at the development of the person through sexuality like Freud did, he looked at the development of the person through the acquisition of language. So, you could argue that some good came out of Freud because people took what he did and ran in other directions. If we wanted to apply psychoanalytic theory or Freudian theory to Romeo and Juliet, he probably would have said that Romeo died because he couldn't have Juliet, and Juliet died because she couldn't have Romeo. And that essentially their deaths were because they did not fulfill their sexual desires. That last bullet there, it's just that they were being ruled by their unconscious primitive urges, their ids, the desire to love each other and be together forever. And their superegos, the unconscious mind that's trying to fit in society, was like, yeah, we should figure out a way to do that, but it caused them to make poor decisions. So their ego, the conscious mind, that could have told them the right way to go about things was just, shush, don't listen to that. It can be quite humorous or fun applying psychoanalytical theory to literature. Sometimes it's good just for a laugh. Anyway, structuralism. Structuralism looks at literature through linguistics, or the study of language, and anthropology, the development of culture. So language is a system of signs that relate to each other, and it is a very cultural thing. The frame of reference for a language is linked intrinsically to its culture. And literature, according to structuralism, uses language differently than other types of texts. For instance, you read a newspaper article or an article on a news website, and that article uses language to relay information. It's presenting factual information to you. Whereas literature uses those same words, and in English, those same 26 letters, but it's relaying something very different to you. It's relaying an interpretation. It's evoking emotional responses, which you don't really get from reading, say, a weather report. Structuralism is used a lot in terms of poetry. When you think about poems and the way lines break, a lot of times people have difficulty reading a poem because of the way the lines break versus how they are punctuated. Structuralism analyzes that. It also pays a lot of attention to the words that the author chooses, because as readers, we should remember that no word is chosen at random, ever, by a writer. So for structuralism, we're not going to focus specifically on Romeo and Juliet. Instead, we're going to look at Shakespeare in general. And one of the biggest complaints now with students is that, oh, he's so difficult to read. I don't understand his language. And there is this assumption that Shakespeare's language is really formal. But it may feel formal to us simply because we do not speak that way anymore. But it's incredibly important to remember that when he was writing, he was actually writing for the average Joe. He was not writing for the cultural elite. He was not writing for the highly educated, because he himself was not highly educated. He was writing for the common man. And looking at linguistics, the study of language and how it evolves and how it is used, we find that his writing is filled with double entendres, things that can mean two things, phrases that can mean two things. There's lots of slang, there's lots of dirty jokes, and then we can add on to that all of the words, literally hundreds of words that he created in English because he was like, hey, I want to say this, but we don't have a word yet for that, so I'm going to make one up. So that's one way of looking at Shakespeare through structuralism. Then we get deconstruction. So if structuralism looks how the language is put together by the writer, deconstruction is like, let's knock it all down. You've got that Jenga tower of words creating a poem or a play or a novel, and we're just going to take that one right there, pull it out, and the whole thing kaplooey. So in deconstruction, all literature should be taken apart. Multiple meanings can be found. Think back to the beginning where I mentioned the puzzle pieces. This is where we're working with them. We take all of those puzzle pieces that create this beautiful play, Romeo and Juliet. We take them all apart. We shuffle them around on the table. We put them all back together the way they fit. And we get a picture. It's maybe similar, maybe not. Maybe it's not one giant picture anymore. Maybe it's not that one giant story, but maybe now we have several smaller pictures. Or maybe we just have a beautiful rainbow blur of color, but there's still meaning there. So how do we do that with Romeo and Juliet? A deconstructionist would say, oh, Romeo and Juliet, maybe it's a love story, maybe it's not. We need to find out more. What is love? What is not love? How does love function in the play? If it is indeed a love story, we need to know what love is and what love is not, and how love functions. So the meaning of the play is determined just as much from what is not said as from what is said. So you can think of deconstructionists as the ones who truly read between the lines. Does Romeo really mean that he loved Juliet? Or is he saying something else? Maybe when he says he loves her, he is really just trying to, get dad mad. Maybe. I don't know. That's up to whoever so chooses to use this lens on Romeo and Juliet. Then we get Laconian Theory, which I mentioned Jacques Lacan before. He was also a psychotherapist like Freud, but he took a bit of a different route. Where Freud was focused on sexual development in terms of making us who we are, Lacan looked at language and felt that language is a symbol and it doesn't always mean what it says on the surface, which, you can think of, I'm sure, plenty of instances in conversations with people where you say something but they don't interpret it how you meant it, but they understood the words. And with Lacan, he focused on the idea of desire. And he felt that desire, and it's not necessarily sexual or romantic desire, it's just desire, wanting something. That desire can never actually be satisfied. The object of desire, which he called the object petit a, is unattainable. So because we can't get what we actually want, we will substitute in all these other things in order to satisfy our desires. And as such, the desire itself becomes other or separate from us. And according to Lacan, which, this he did take from Freud and let it stick around, the quintessential other, and by default, desire, is the mother. And if you're familiar at all with psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, relationships with parents, and predominantly the mother is an incredibly large part of the process. And we can take Lacanian theory and apply that to Romeo and Juliet and say, well, neither one of them really knows what they want, so they put each other in the place of that object petit a. So they turn each other into the object that they desire. But since they can't actually satisfy the desire, they both end up dead. Essentially, that means that they are both illusions of the other's fantasies, so that Romeo didn't actually want Juliet. He was just hoping that she would make him happy, and she didn't really want or love him. She was just kind of hoping that he was going to rescue her from her unhappy place in her family, and that didn't happen, and there we go. Interesting interpretation, by all means. Then we've got cultural studies. And this is a term for a subgroup of critical theories that look at literature in the context of the culture it reflects. And this can be a little bit complex because it looks at literature through multiple lenses at the same time. So it looks at a historical context of a piece as well as any other cultural references. So we have New Historicism. It looks at a piece of literature when it was based on when it was written. What was society like? If the characters, if Romeo and Juliet were real people, what would their daily lives have been like? History is used as background information for many other theories, but new historicists see it as really intrinsic to the ultimate meaning of literature. So for Romeo and Juliet, a new historicist would want to know exactly what life in Verona, Italy was like at the time the play is set. They would then compare Shakespeare's telling of the story to all of the previous incarnations. The story of Romeo and Juliet, actually, the names Romeo and Juliet predate Shakespeare. They would also look at the play in terms of what life was like when it was written, when Shakespeare wrote it. All about the history here. Queer theory is rooted in the 1960s, and I think the big thing to remember here, even though it's called queer theory, it really looks at anything that is not heteronormative in terms of sexuality. So it looks for queer themes and characters, anybody that might fall on the LGBTQ plus rainbow, not specifically, queer or gay writers. It looks at how the characters are portrayed. It looks how language is used in order to trace queer presentations, because it hasn't always been open. But this, anything that is not heteronormative includes things like cross-dressing, which is very apparent in Shakespeare, and anything less than vanilla in terms of relationship dynamics. So we could apply that to Romeo and Juliet by looking at Mercutio, Romeo's close friend, who in terms of queer theory is frequently painted as gay, simply because of how he presents himself and how he is perceived by others in the play. But it could also look at the relationship of Romeo and Juliet as a mockery of heteronormative love, because it fails miserably. Or it could be looked at as a trope of forbidden love, which queer love is often labeled. Outside of Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare has a couple of characters, actually several, that cross-dress and play at being someone other than who they are for plot purposes, like in As You Like It, The Merchant of Venice, or Twelfth Night. Then we get Post-Colonial Theory, which looks at literature through a lens of how cultures interact with each other during and after colonization, because cultures do not exist in a bubble and elements always cross over. It frequently analyzes the split between us and other. We could look at Romeo and Juliet along the lines of a turf war. Think the Leo movie version, or West Side Story, which is an adaptation. It would look at the social groups, primarily the Capulets and the Montagues, and try to find similarities and differences. Another example that works well in Shakespeare is The Tempest, where we get the character Caliban, who's described as brutish and primitive, and he's definitely other. It's not a particularly favorable character. Great play, though. And then we get American multiculturalism. And this lens allows critics to see how various cultures commingle within the larger American culture, and specifically in the United States. It contains the subdivisions of African American, Native American, Latinx, Asian American, among others. And it looks at the specific cultures, but it also looks at how they fit into American culture and how they are seen by American culture as a whole. And while that can't be applied specifically to Shakespeare, we can look at the adaptation of Romeo and Juliet set in America, aka West Side Story. So an American multicultural theorist would look at how the Latinx community is portrayed in the musical, and that could actually vary between the original film production, not even to mention the Broadway productions, and the newer remake. So all in all, this is critical theory lenses in a nutshell. It's a lot. The video is going to be posted. I will also post it as a PowerPoint so that you have it as a reference. And on to the next.